Monastics keep their rank in the monastery according to the date of their entry, the virtue of their lives, and the decision of the prioress or abbot. The prioress or abbot is not to disturb the flock entrusted to them, nor make any unjust arrangements, as though they had the power to do whatever they wished. They must constantly reflect that they will have to give God an account of all their decisions and actions. Therefore, when the members come for the kiss of peace and for communion, when they lead psalms or stand in the choir, they do so in the order already existing among them or decided by the abbot or prioress. Absolutely nowhere shall age automatically determine rank. Remember that Samuel and Daniel were still boys when they judged their elders. Therefore, apart from those mentioned above, whom the abbot or prioress have for some overriding consideration promoted, or for a specific reason demoted, all the rest should keep to the order of their entry. For example, someone who came into the monastery at the second hour of the day must recognize that they are junior to someone who came in at the first hour, regardless of age or distinction. The young, however, are to be disciplined in everything by everyone. In the Benedictine monastery, there are going to be significant differences between people who come. We've already covered a good amount of those differences, but just as a reminder, you have a monastery that is made up of old and young. And we're talking about as old as nearing the end of life and as young as not even old enough to sign their own documents. So you're made up of old, young, rich, and poor. We just had a chapter about nobility and the poor. But you also have male and female. You also have various other distinctions that happen between people in the monastery, such as those distinctions of priestly versus lay. But at the same time, Benedict is trying to make very clear that there are to be, as it comes to the monastery and the rank of the monastery, no one that ever can presume, based upon their past life and identity, that they are owed or are given anything other than what the prioress or abbot deem to be appropriate. There is to be utter equity and equanimity in the monastery. There is to be no distinctions between persons, other than when the date of their entrance to the monastery was marked. And the reason why this is very important is because when one is entering the Benedictine life, one is not merely entering into another social club or another marker of my social impact. You are entering into something that has unclothed you of all distinctions heading into it. You cannot rest on any of your past laurels, nor can you rest on your own age, experience, or anything else than when you have chosen this as a profession of monasticism. And that there is not to be distinctions between anyone in the monastery, and that this is to be the way that we work because we are working up the ladder of humility. We are working towards Christ, who showed all humility in laying down his glory, his honor, his power to become a servant of all. That is exactly what is expected out of monastics that enter the Benedictine monastery as well. The younger monastics then must respect their elders, and the elders must love their juniors. When they address one another, no one should be allowed to do so simply by name. Rather, the elders call the younger sister or brother, and the younger members call their elders nonna or nonus, which are translated as venerable one. But the abbot and prioress, because we believe that they hold the place of Christ, are to be called abbot and prioress, not for any claim of their own, but out of honor and love for Christ. They, for their part, must reflect on this and in their behavior show themselves worthy of such honor. Wherever members meet, the junior asks the elder for a blessing. When older members come by, the younger ones rise and offer them a seat and do not presume to sit down unless the older bids them. In this way, they do what the words of Scripture say. They should each try to be the first to show respect for the other. In the oratory and at the table, the young are kept in rank and under discipline. Outside or anywhere else, they should be supervised and controlled until they are old enough to be responsible. Respecting those who are due respect is something in which everyone is expected to show at the Benedictine monastery. You are to respect those for whom you call family. And even in the things that Benedict says you should call one another, notice that the older calling the younger brother or sister is a sign of respect of them. They're not called child, or they're not called children or kid or something that is demeaning to their age. But likewise, the older are referred to as venerable, and they're referred to in accordance to their age, which is appropriate, but not in again, a fashion that would be demeaning. It's not as if we are demeaning either the young or the old. They are to refer to each other in respect for one another. The abbot or prioress, however, operate in a different way. And this is a helpful thing for us to recognize. There are those for whom are due to be shown a higher level of respect, not for any reason of their own earning, but rather the place in the community of which they operate. The abbot and prioress are to be treated in the same respect as we treat Christ. We are to listen and obey the abbot and prioress as we obey and respect Christ. And therefore, they have a title that, of course, they have a title that they must themselves be shown worthy of holding. We're not going to be putting just anyone as abbot or prioress of the community. Go and read those earlier chapters to see how to see exactly why that's important. But in everything, we are to respect the place and position of the people around us. And Sister Joan, I think, has a helpful note on this. If we really believe that we are all created in the image of God, that there's not one person, rich or poor, old or young, or anything else, that is not created in God's image, that means we have to have a comparable level of respect for the person of whom we are speaking to or of whom we are in the presence of as God himself. There is a requirement for us to show that, not out of any self-effacing respect towards someone who is perhaps owed a superiority, but no, rather instead as we greet Christ who became humbled and one of us. The point of who or what we call people in the monastery is once again to drive in that there is a respect due and owed to everyone, not just for some, not just for the experienced, not just for those who have taken on the responsibilities of abbot or prioress, but for everyone. And likewise, in showing that respect for everyone, we are driving home again. There is no distinctions between persons in the body of Christ. In choosing an abbot or prioress, the guiding principle should always be that the one placed in office be the one selected either by the whole community acting unanimously out of reverence for God, or by some part of the community, no matter how small, which possesses sounder judgment. Goodness of life and wisdom in teaching must be the criteria for choosing the one to be made abbot or prioress, even if they are the last in community rank. May God forbid that a whole community should conspire to elect a prioress or abbot who goes along with its own evil ways. But if it does, and if the bishop of the diocese or any Benedictine leaders or other Christians in the area come to know of these evil ways to any extent, they must block the success of this wicked conspiracy and set a worthy person in charge of God's house. They may be sure that they will receive a generous reward for this if they do it with pure motives and zeal for God's honor. Conversely, they may be equally sure that to neglect to do so is sinful. preference of who becomes the prioress or abbot of a monastery has everything to do with the wisdom and teaching of the church. And likewise, those who show forth those qualities are ones who may be qualified for that position. It should be noted that this does not exclude people who come from differing backgrounds. It doesn't say that you have to have a theologian, that you have to have a philosopher, that you have to have a biblical studies expert, that you have to have... It doesn't say anything about that. It says, rather, that those whose life and work are wise and faithful. Those who are showing forth the attitudes and likewise the values of the Benedictine life. There are none, even the last in community rank. Isn't that interesting that Benedict notes that? Even if it should be the last in community rank that is chosen as abbot or prioress. That is the will of the community, and likewise, God willing, the will of the Holy Spirit. Those who are last in the community can indeed be the person who is called to that office. However, it is to be noted that calling an abbot or prioress merely out of agenda is something Benedict specifically warns against. If calling an abbot or prioress that fits the agenda of the community in a way in which they retain perhaps certain things or are able to perform certain things that they wish, and they simply find someone to fill that spot that would fit their fancy, that, for Benedict, is not what calling an abbot or prioress is meant to do. It's not people rubber stamping someone who's simply going to fulfill the needs and desires and passions of a community that has given into unhelpful appetites. It is someone who is in their wisdom and teaching, holding out for them Christ, and asking them to be better, to be disciplined, to be loving, to be humble. And those are often not things that come naturally. Rather, those are things that must be encouraged, prayed for, and in the virtues in which we can train up, we are to be trained up in those virtues. But the person to be serving as abbot or prioress, most importantly, needs to be someone who is after the mind and heart of Christ, first and foremost, regardless of any other thing or experience that they have to offer. Once in office, the abbot and prioress must keep constantly in mind the nature of the burden that they have received and remember to whom they will have to give an account of their stewardship. Let them recognize that the goal must be to profit the community members, not preeminence for themselves. They ought therefore to be learned in divine law, so that they have a treasury of knowledge from which they can bring out what is new and what is old. The abbot and prioress must be chaste, temperate, and merciful, always letting mercy triumph over judgment, so that they too may win mercy. They must hate faults but love the members. When they must punish them, they must use prudence and avoid extremes. Otherwise, by rubbing too hard to remove the rust, they may break the vessel. They are to distrust their own frailty and remember not to crush the bruised reed. By this, we do not mean that they should allow faults to flourish, but rather, as we have already said, they should prune them away with prudence and love, as they see best for each individual. Let them strive to be loved rather than feared. Excitable, anxious, extreme, obstinate, jealous, or overly suspicious, the abbot or prioress must not be. Such a person is never at rest. Instead, they must show forethought and consideration in their orders, and whether the task they assign concerns God or the world, they should be discerning and moderate, bearing in mind the discretion of holy Jacob, who said, "If I drive my flocks too hard, they will die in a single day." Therefore, drawing on this and other examples of discretion, they must so arrange everything that the strong have something to yearn for and the weak nothing to run from. They must above all keep this rule in every detail, so that when they have ministered well, they will hear from God that good servant heard who... Let me start over on that one. They must above all keep this rule in every detail, so that when they have ministered well, they will hear from God what that good servant heard who gave the other members of the household grain at the proper time. I tell you solemnly, God will put this one in charge of greater things. Faithful, discerning, and clear-minded. Those can be the three things that the prioress or abbot is always charged to be. They are called to be faithful. They are faithful to the rule of which they are under. They are not outside of the rule just because they are the abbot or prioress. But in fact, they are exemplars of the rule. They are to show to the community what the rule really means. And in so doing, they have to be faithful to everything that the rule demands of them for the purposes of the love, temperance, kindness, and prudence of the mind of Christ. But they are also to be clear-minded. They have to be able to have clear vision, not clouded by anything else. Hence why Benedict warns against those things that unsettle us. The types of things that drive us to be fidgety, to be looking over our shoulder, to give the community a high level of anxiety. And anytime that you've ever worked with or for someone who has high anxiety, you'll probably know what I mean whenever I'm talking about the anxiety that can be brought by someone who does not know how to be clear-headed. Or, to put it in another way, someone who doesn't know how to sit still. Can we sit with the tension of discernment, which is that other thing? Discernment in everything. Because the rule is often open-ended at various points, there has to be an active discernment that is ongoing in every circumstance by the Holy Spirit speaking through the community, but also by the prudence of the abbot and prioress to make the wise decision. Not a hasty decision, not a convenient decision, a decision that will indeed fit the whole and serve the whole. Such as Benedict notes, the weak have something that is not going to scare them away, it's not going to overburden them, and the strong have something to strive for, something to continue to move towards. In these three ways, the abbot and prioress are meant to be exemplars of humility, of all of those things about the way that Christ ministers to us, and likewise to be able to show the whole purpose and goal of the rule, to move more and more close to the mind and love of Christ, and to, again, walk up that ladder of humility that leads us to the heavenly places. Too often in the past, the appointment of a sub-prioress or prior has been the source of serious contention in monasteries. Some, puffed up by the evil spirit of pride and thinking of themselves as a second prioress or abbot, usurp tyrannical power and foster contention and discord in their communities. This occurs especially in monasteries where the same bishop and the same prioress or abbot appoint both the abbot and prioress and the prior or sub-prioress. It is easy to see what an absurd arrangement this is, because from the very first moment of appointment they are given grounds for pride, as their thoughts suggest to them that they are exempt from the authority of the prioress or abbot. After all, you were made sub-prioress or prior by the same members who made the prioress or abbot. This is an open invitation to envy, quarrels, slander, rivalry, factions, and disorders of every kind, with the result that while the prioress and sub-prioress or abbot and prior pursue conflicting policies, their own souls are inevitably endangered by this discord. And at the same time, the monastics under them take sides and so go on to their ruin. The responsibility for this evil and dangerous situation rests on the heads of those who initiated such a state of confusion. Anytime that you have a shared authority between more than one person, there is always the potential for rivalries, for differences of opinion to bloom into something that is unhealthy for the whole. And as a just simple fact of the matter, when you have two people who are working together, there are going to be differences of opinion. There are going to be differences of core values. And in the general sense, people often, when they have no solid direction or no solid ground for being able to make decisions, it always comes down to a competition between who is more likable. And this is where Sister Joan has a helpful point, which is that leadership and authority are two different things. Authority is something that one is invested, something that one receives as the authority to do such and so. For example, pastors have a certain authority that we have, either institutionally or otherwise, to do certain things, but leadership is distinct from the power so to do something. Authority can so easily be turned into authoritarianism. I have the authority to do such and so forth, and therefore I will exercise my authority to do so because it is my right to do so. How often have we heard that language in the United States? The thing is, Sister Jones says that's not how the monastery can be run. You cannot have a distinction in authority that leads to these authoritarian struggles. Rather, there has to be a clear demarcation of who has the authority invested in them to make the proper decision and who does not have that authority. And in that demarcation between who has the ability and power so to do, we make very clear that there are responsibilities that those positions must have. Practical example of this is when Benedict warns against electing sub-prioresses and sub-abbots because they are elected by the same community as the prioress or abbot. And the reason why this is important is because it's a significantly different distinction than someone who's the prioress or abbot and someone who is the cellarer. The prioress and abbot and the cellarer are in everything given authority to do what they have to do. The cellarer has a specific task to be up to, the upkeep of the physical monastery things. The clothes, the food, the kitchen, the utensils, things like that. And it is wise for the leadership of the prioress or abbot to allow the cellarer to do what they must do. The abbot or prioress that is unwise would be meddling in all of their things and not allowing the cellarer to do what they need to. If the prioress or abbot is using their authority to make decisions that the cellarer should be making, that is an authoritarian move, not leadership. Leadership for the prioress or abbot in that situation is to put someone that they believe is going to be good in that place and let them do their job. Let them do what they have been gifted to. And often we might discover that they have gifts that we don't have, that the abbot or prioress has a particular lack of a gift that is necessary for the cellarer. And it would be wise and prudent to let the cellarer do what they need to. But whenever we set up two rivals, someone who is serving the same function or role in some way, shape, or form as someone else with no distinction between them really other than title, Benedict says that is asking for trouble. and that we should avoid doing that so as not to lose the whole game. The whole thing that we are trying to work towards in the Benedictine monastery is humility. And anytime that we set up competition between rivals, that completely destroys the whole thing that we're trying to do. That should be avoided at all costs, says Benedict, and for perhaps obvious reason. For the preservation of peace and love, we have therefore judged it best for the abbot or prioress to make all decisions in the conduct of the monastery. If possible, as we have already established, the whole operation of the monastery should be managed through deans and other directions of the abbot or prioress. Then, so long as it is entrusted to more than one, no individual will yield to pride. But if local conditions call for it, or the community makes a reasonable and humble request, and the prioress or abbot judges it best, then let them, with the advice of members who reverence God, choose the one they want and themselves make that one the sub-prioress or prior. The sub-prioress and prior, for their part, are to carry out respectfully what the prioress or abbot assigns, and do nothing contrary to their wishes or arrangements, because the more they are set above the rest, the more they should be concerned to keep what the rule commands. If these sub-prioresses or priors are found to have serious faults, or led astray by conceit and grow proud, or show open contempt for the holy rule, they are to be warned verbally as many as 4 times. If they do not amend, they are to be punished as required by the discipline of the rule. Then, if they still do not reform, they are to be deposed from the rank of sub-prioress or prior and placed by someone worthy. If after all that they are not peaceful and obedient members of the community, they should even be expelled from the monastery. Yet the abbot or prioress should reflect that they must give God an account of all their judgments, lest the flames of jealousy or rivalry sear their soul. Benedict goes right from warning about these sub-prioresses or priors to then telling if it should be locally conditioned and necessary. Then here is how you are to choose those who are to be prioresses or sub-prioresses or sub-abbots. And it should be noted, he first outlines the reason why it should be perhaps exceedingly rare that these be appointed. Because he says, we already have deans who are serving as elders of the monastery under the direction of the prioress or abbot, and that they are already acting in some ways as leaders of the community that are all in responsiveness to the prioress or abbot and in the prudence of their decisions, and that it should be that a well-working monastery should most likely have all of these things in place, whether it be large or small. But if it should be that there are circumstances where it makes sense for there to be a sub-prioress or abbot, notice that their qualities are the same sorts of qualities that Benedict over and over says need to be present in anyone who takes on additional responsibility in the monastery, which is that they are faithful to the rule. They need to be people who are going to, again, be exemplars of the rule and exemplars in humility. They're not to be rivalrous or wrangling or anything like that. But importantly, it should be noted, they are still subject to the prioress or abbot. They are very clearly subject to the only one who has the ability to make decisions for the monastery in these larger cases. Again, every small case, such as kitchen work and things like that, that's for the deans or for the cellarer or for people who are in authority to make those decisions. Those that the prioress or abbot delegates to the appropriate people. Same thing with a sub-prioress or abbot. They are to recognize fully that they are under the rule and they are under the authority of the prioress and abbot. If they show that they can't deal with it, they are removed. If they show by their content of life, then it works. Again, the rule of St. Benedict has all kinds of exceptions, all kinds of flexibility to it, because every community is different. Every community has different needs, and there might indeed be a perfectly acceptable circumstance in which there needs to be a sub-prioress or sub-abbot, exceedingly rare as those might be. In everything, Benedict says, they must be exemplars of the rule. They must be exemplars of Christ. They must be in all things humble. If they are those things, then do as the community needs. At the door of the monastery, place a sensible person who knows how to take a message and deliver a reply, and whose wisdom keeps them from roaming about. This porter will need a room near the entrance so that visitors will always find someone there to answer them. As soon as anyone knocks or a poor person calls out, the porter will reply, "Thanks be to God," or "Your blessing, please." Then, with all the gentleness that comes from reverence of God, provide a prompt answer with the warmth of love. Let the porter be given one of the younger members if help is needed. The monastery should, if possible, be so constructed that within it all necessities such as water, mill, and garden are contained, and the various crafts are practiced. Then there will be no need for the members to roam outside, because this is not at all good for their souls. We wish this rule to be read often in the community so that none of the members can offer the excuse of ignorance. Sister Joan has a wonderful note on this chapter, which is, of all of the activities and confusing things that Benedict says in the 5th century that the 21st century is wondering about, probably one of the chief ones, or the chief questions, is why does Benedict have a whole chapter designated about how to answer the door? Isn't that interesting? It's a whole chapter on someone who's specifically tasked with answering the door of the monastery. Someone who actually is called to this task specifically out of the community as part of their responsibility. Well, I think this actually has a lot more for us than we might first anticipate. This is not merely a functional need for Benedict. This is a theological act that Benedict is always asking us in the rule, but most specifically, notice the greeting that the porter gives to people who come to the door. "Thanks be to God," or "Your blessing, please." Note that in both of these, thanks is being given, but also a recognition that the person who comes to the door is bearing blessings for the community. That, in fact, a visitor at the door is an act of gift, and that they are to be respected in the same way as receiving gifts from God. That they are not an inconvenience to the monastery, but rather that they are, in fact, an opportunity for God's grace to be shown to the monastery. Who knows what this visitor comes to bring? Do they come to bring their needs before the community so that the community, out of their abilities, can bless what they need? Are they bringing themselves as potential members of the monastery that are looking to climb that ladder of humility? Are they someone who's coming to drop by a gift to the monastery of clothes for the monks to wear? Who knows what they're there for? But in everything, whether it be a request at the door or whether it be a gift that is being given to the monastery, everyone is to be treated as an unexpected blessing from God. And because of this, the doorkeeper, the porter, is someone who always needs to be ready to answer the door. They need to be someone who is not going to be just wandering around, who's not going to just be, twiddling their thumbs or things like that, but actually is spiritually and actively ready to answer the door in a way that is an invitation to anyone who is there. Isn't that a wonderful thing to think about for us here sitting in all of our technology of the 21st century? Do we know how to answer the door? Do we know how to treat every interaction with someone at our metaphorical doorstep, whether it be online or whether it be a physical door? Do we know how to treat every single person that we run across as an unexpected blessing of God? What would it look like? I really would like to imagine, what would it look like if we started actually answering the door, expecting God to bless us in an unexpected way?